Today we'll be looking at 5-year-old budget hardware from AMD. The A8-6500 was released in June of 2013 for about $110 US, while the R7 250 came in at approximately $89 a few months later in September of that same year. Today on eBay you can grab the A8-6500 for $30 and the R7 250 for $32. However, the R7 250, a Dell version, is low profile, so that maybe cause for concern if you don't have a low profile case with proper ventilation, as we'll see later. I did try to jimmy up a regular size bracket to put it in a standard case, but I ended up throwing it out because when I put it in the case, there was a gap where you screw in the GPU to the rear of the case. I might try to make another one, but that'll be a story for a different time. One thing I should probably also mention about this GPU is that it only has a DVI and DisplayPort output in the back, so HDMI won't work with this unless you get a converter. The rest of the system specs are listed in the description, but I've paired these components with 6 gigs of 1866 MHz RAM by Crucial, and both the games and the OS are on an old, slow and loud 1TB Sata hard drive by Hitachi. And that is a 3 gigabit per second model. Alright, let's look at some benchmarks. I'm focusing on esports titles because they're typically less demanding than non-esports titles. And this is a budget setup, so yeah. Let's start with Dota 2. For the settings, I turned everything down to its minimum, except I put the render quality all the way up. I did this because if you turn everything off but put the render quality high, the game still looks pretty damn good. The gameplay you see here is from Overthrow, but the benchmarks were run in regular 5v5. At 1080p you can expect around 84-85 frames per second average. Maximum frame rate was 102.8. Minimum frame rate was 46.2 with a 1% low of 20 and a 0.1% low of 12.6. Those are pretty low for the 1% and 0.1%, but I didn't see it in game much at all. It was very smooth throughout the whole benchmark. Now because 1080p averaged over 80, I decided to skip 720 and just go straight to 1440 and 4K. Now at 1440p there wasn't a huge difference, and I wonder if that's because I ran the benchmark for twice as long. In either case, I was still a little surprised by these numbers. Here we get an average of 81 with a 1% low of 19. In the middle of teamfights, however, when there's more action on screen than usual, the frame rate would jump back and forth between 55 and 70, which is still very, very playable. Now moving on to 1440, I was even more impressed. Here we got an average of 40.5 frames per second with a max of 54.8, 1% low of 15.5, and a 0.1% low of 10.5. By today's standards, that's not great, but for a card that's 5 years old, it's not really bad at all. Now with action on screen, the frame rate would bounce around in between 20 and 30 FPS. That's still playable, but it's cutting it close to being not. Now for the final Dota 2 benchmark, I left the resolution at 4K but turned the render quality down to 60%, and this yielded an average frame rate of 69 frames per second with a 1% low of 15 and a 0.1% low of 11. It looked okay, but I would prefer leaving it at 1080p or even 1440 and just cranking up the resolution, not the resolution, the render quality. That looks much better than leaving it at 4K and turning the render quality down to 60. Next up we have Rocket League. For this benchmark, I did the same as in Dota, where I turned everything down and off except for the render quality. Additionally, with each resolution I alternated between the highest render quality and the lowest. Having a pixelated perspective in this game isn't really a gameplay detriment as much as it can be in other titles. On the left we have our low render, on the right we have high render, and on top we have the resolution. I'm pretty sure the 0.1% low on the left over here is a discrepancy. Maybe I paused the game or something, or the internet went out, I'm not sure, but Yeah, as you can see on the right, it's much higher, and it should be higher on the left because the settings are turned down. Cue the music. So overall, Rocket League was smooth and enjoyable, although I did notice a few stutters when explosions would happen. Those ended up minimizing to next to nothing. Now with CSGO, I also kept everything on low, except I also alternated between changing the model textures to its highest and its lowest. As you saw, CSGO got well over 60 frames a second all the way up until we hit 1440p and went from minimum render quality to max. At 4K, that didn't make much of a difference, and by that time it wasn't really playable anymore. So you could go up to 1440p and still have a half decent experience. More than half decent, I would say. Decent and then some. Here's Fortnite. Fortnite was playable up to 1080p. Going to 440, we hit an average of 19 frames per second, which is not really playable in my opinion for that kind of game. And I would actually leave it at 720p personally to hit the near 60 FPS frame rate average. As I mentioned earlier, this is a low profile card, and as such, it is in a low profile case. I started benchmarking with the side panel off, but in the middle of CSGO, I put the panel back on to see what the temperature would be like. It wasn't pretty, as the side panel of this Asus case has no airflow. The GPU did not take long to reach 90 plus degrees Celsius, which is far from ideal. Looking up the AMD forums for the max temperatures of this GPU, I found out that it starts throttling down above 85 degrees. I decided to finish benching with the side panel off to show what kind of performance you can get if you have proper cooling. So is this card for you? If you can't find a higher performing low profile card for around $30 and you have a low profile system with enough airflow, then yeah, it's a decent buy. If you have a standard case, then you might be able to get away with removing the eye shield altogether. Keyword here being might. Removing the I/O shield would no doubt be a more viable option if your motherboard lies flat so that the GPU doesn't sag. Another option would be to make your own standard size I/O shield out of an unneeded PCIe backplate cover or maybe some acrylic plastic, which would be easier to cut into, but you would have to heat up to bend it to make it to the shape of a rear I/O shield. I hope this video helped someone. Until next time, take care.